over the course of that spring and summer of 1972, they collected more than twice as many signatures as they needed to get it on the ballot. That was how strong the feelings were at the time. Now, back then, they had the advantage that they had long lines of people waiting in lines in movie theaters. That was the year that The Godfather came out, and there were huge lines everywhere. And I was talking to one of the guys who was the executive director of the group, and they said they got probably the majority of their signatures in movie lines. That initiative made it on the ballot, clearly, and in November of '72, it passed with 72% of the vote, which until then was the highest vote percentage ever received by an initiative in Washington State. So again, you see how important this was to the people. And it became known as the Public Disclosure Act. And many of you who have been around Washington for a while have heard of the Public Disclosure Act. What people had come to realize was that if we, the people, are sovereign, which we are, meaning we control the government, then we have to know what the government is doing, what the people who are in the government are doing, in order to be able to hold them accountable. And we must also know who is it that is trying to influence candidates and elected officials, such as through campaign contributions. There were four major parts of the Public Disclosure Act. The first was campaign finance disclosure. Any of you who are run for candidates are familiar with the Public Disclosure Commission having to submit detailed reports about who contributes to your campaign, what you spend your campaign money on, what loans you've taken, what pledges you've received, all of those things. That all came about because of I-276. The second major part of the law was personal finance disclosure, meaning anyone who runs for office or serves in public office, and including high-level non-elected offices, has to submit a report every year on who they work for, what businesses they own or on the board of directors of, how much money they have, and in broad categories, not exact numbers, what banks they do business with, what real estate they own, all kinds of financial disclosures, the point of which is so that the people will know what potential conflicts of interest they have. That's what that's all about. The third major part was lobbyist disclosure. People wanted to know how much money are lobbyists spending trying to influence our candidates and elected officials. And interestingly, the candidates and elected officials have to also report how much money they had spent on them, like lunches and dinners and stuff, by lobbyists. And so we can match up those and see who's left out something. And the fourth part, which was probably the least talked about during the campaign for I-276, but which has clearly become the most widespread and most used part of the law, was the public records portion. In 2005, I sponsored a bill to separate the public records portion out of RCW 4217, the Public Disclosure Act, and put it in its own chapter of law, which is now RCW 4256. And that was just because it had grown so much and become so unwieldy that it really needed to be a separate law. So, talk a little bit about this public records portion of the law. At its core, it says that all records that are prepared, owned, used, or retained, and notice it's or, not and, prepared, owned, used, or retained by any public agency at the state or local level, is subject to inspection and copying by anyone who asks, unless it is exempted by a specific provision of law. And at the time the law was passed, there were 10 exemptions in I-276. Now there's about 500. People say, what's up with that? Well, a couple of things. First of all, the Federal Freedom of Information Act has only 10 exemptions, but they're very broad and open to interpretation. There's a lot of disputes about what they mean. And it allows federal agencies to pretty much arbitrarily deny access to records because they think they can fit it into one of those 10 exemptions. In the Public Records Act, there's 500 because the law requires them to be very narrowly crafted and very narrowly interpreted. And so you see exemptions for a specific field in a database.